Well, it's great to see everybody here this evening. You know, this week as I was preparing for this lesson, I was probably a quarter of the way into it, and then Friday my wife reminded me that today's Super Bowl. And I was like, well, that adds a little extra pressure to things, probably more pressure and brevity than content, but nonetheless. And then my daughter brings her boyfriend TJ, and so I've got all kinds of pressure around me here this evening. But it's great to see everybody that came out this evening. This evening's lesson is, like a lot of the lessons we've been hearing, is going to try to relate back to some of the Bible readings that we've been doing. I'm going to kind of spend just the first kickoff in Ephesians 5, 1 and 2. In Ephesians 5, 1 and 2, it says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us, and give himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." And what I want to do this evening is think about this as being imitators of God and kind of go back into some pivotal points in biblical history and kind of then work our way towards what that means to us today. But I thought I'd start here. This is a picture here on the left. At the bottom is a city. Those of you from Texas might know this desolate country. This is Alpine, Texas at the bottom. And probably the only thing in Alpine that I understand is there is a college called Sul Ross. And then at the top is a bronc rider with a cowboy. And I've always been intrigued by this photo. One, not just because it was amazing to me that you could actually do Photoshop in 1965, but because more so that the person on this horse is my dad. And he went to school in Sul Ross, and the yearbooks they gave everybody in 1965, the very first page when you open it up on both sides, that's why you see the crease in the middle, is this picture. And it's a picture of him on a bronc, which he did ride broncs and rope calves, over the town of Alpine, Texas. And it's always been one that as a kid I would look and go, wow, that's pretty cool to be on a book like that everybody has from your college. And we grew up really a lot with horses and cattle and rodeo scene. My mother, my father both participated in rodeo events in their younger days, and my dad continued even when we were kids. And so it became something that you're around all the time. You're going to rodeo events, you're participating in things. We had cattle, we had horses, and you grow up in it. You grow up and around it, and you start to imitate your father. And that's me on the right, my early, younger, thinner, dumber college days, with a horse that we actually raised. But I had a horse all through college, even when I first came to St. Louis, and participated in, I didn't do any bronc riding like my dad did, but more team roping event. But at least I say I didn't do bronc riding. I didn't willingly get on a horse that was trained and bred to buck. Sometimes it just happened, but it wasn't intentional. And so tonight, with this being the backdrop of imitating our Father and imitating God. And so I want to go back to a few pivotal points in biblical history that we're all very familiar with. One, a little bit around starting at the very beginning with Adam and Eve, then fast forward into the time of Moses, and then we'll come into Jesus Christ and his time here on earth. So starting at the very beginning with Adam and Eve, this actually ties back. If you had a chance to hear Ryan Boyer's sermon Monday, it was sent out via link, and I had a chance to watch that. He was the opening presentation at the lecture seminar there for Florida College, and he hit right on this, and I was like, wow, this ties great into what I wanted to talk about. So I'm stealing a little bit of what he shared there. He went in a lot more depth and, of course, did it more eloquently, but I do want to start here because in Genesis 1, and as Ryan read in his sermon Monday, he read part of verses in Genesis 1. I'm going to read 24 through 27, and we're going to start to see this repetitive nature where God says, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals according to its kind." And then it talks further, God made wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds, and God saw it was good. But then we see a change. Everything's been made at this point according to their kinds. But in verse 26 it says, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move on the ground. So everything that was made according to its kind is now being ruled over by mankind. And in 27, God created mankind in his own image, in the image of God. He created them male, female, he created them. So what's interesting about this is, as we think about being imitators of God, well, we started out on a pretty strong foot. We were created in the likeness of God. But as we know in the story of Adam and Eve, that still led to them falling into temptation and ultimately sin by eating fruit from the tree of life. This was the one command. When I look back on this, it just amazes me more and more. One simple, seemingly simple command to not eat fruit from the tree of life. It wasn't like the command was don't murder somebody, don't commit adultery, don't steal from Eve or any of the other things around there. It was just don't eat fruit from this one tree. You can eat fruit from anywhere else. I don't think they were starving. They had plenty in the Garden of Eden, but still they were tempted and committed sin. And it changed the course of humanity forever, right? Brought sin and suffering. And so sometimes we ask, well, why would this happen? I mean, if God's creating man in his image, then why would he let man fall into temptation and sin? And we would probably, after reading the Bible and studying, we'd say, well, it's free will. Right? He did create us, but he didn't create robots that were programmed to obey every single command to the letter of the law. He created people that could discern and make choices and decisions. And all along, this was part of his plan. And he knew that we would never really understand or appreciate or see the glory of God or even be able to love God if we didn't have free will. I mean, if we were dating someone, I know some of us are married, but back in the dating days, or maybe we're dating now, or maybe we're going to, when you start to like someone, you hope there's some reciprocal piece that on their part they like you back. You don't force them into liking you or loving you. Right? You hope there's a reciprocal piece. I mean, forcing them even sounds a bit criminal, right? You hope that's reciprocal and that they love you back, and it's no different here. You have a choice. God wants to enable choice. Do we choose to love him, or do we choose something else? And God wanted Adam and Eve to love him, and when they committed this sin, we know they had consequences. But even those consequences were out of love. And ultimately, we see God's mercy. He could have killed Adam and Eve, but he sent them out of the garden to toil over the land. He showed mercy. There were consequences. You know, I know with our kids, we always talk about you mess up, there's going to be consequences. We can forgive, we can look past, but it doesn't mean you're not accountable for what you did. We have consequences. My mom, growing up, she would, once in a while, I did get a spanking, once in a while. I always say my brother got a lot more. But there's a few times she would say, this is going to hurt me more than it does you. And in my head, I never said this out loud. I was like, right. I'm like, I'm the one with the red mark on my fanny, not you. This is going to hurt me, I know. But we know now as adults what that meant, right? We know the consequences weren't easy to give if you're giving them out of love. We don't like to discipline our kids, at least most of the time. But we know we need to, right? To instruct them, to guide them. So hopefully they can be raised and be imitators of us and really of God. So I'm going to fast forward. Adam and Eve kind of screwed things up in the garden for us, so thanks. And we get to Moses. And we fast forward to Moses, and this is after he's brought the Israelites out of Egypt and they've escaped Pharaoh's wrath. All the amazing signs these people were able to see. And we know in Exodus 20, if we read Exodus 20, I'm going to read a little bit here, but this is where everybody's at the base of Mount Sinai, Moses and the Israelites, and God's starting to articulate what we know of as the Ten Commandments. And in Exodus 20, verses 1 through 6 says, "And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, I am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." So in Genesis here, when we went back in Genesis, there was basically one simple command that God was asking Adam and Eve, and now we're starting to get into a series of rules and commandments that are handed down from God. Couldn't handle one, so let's get a little more detailed, and let's give more. And as we know, these first two commandments that are listed here in what I read, right? We know there's 10, but the first two, don't have any gods before me and don't worship idols. And what happens? Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to receive more laws and instruction, and the people can't even hold to the first two commandments that they were given. They create a golden calf and start to worship an idol. So man couldn't handle one simple one. Now we've got 10. And we know throughout a lot of the Old Testament, it isn't just 10. God gives a lot of clear instruction throughout kind of the first 5 books, and as we're reading, we're seeing this, right? Do this, construct that, here's how to worship, here's how to live your social life, there's all these things we're reading about. And I haven't went in through and counted all these myself, but in reading, and I'm going to say maybe around 613, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's more than 10 commandments that God gives his people. And in high instruction, right? Very detailed commandments. And that doesn't work either, right? We know that there's this series of giving commandments and laws and people rebelling and breaking those laws. And then we get more laws, and the cycle continues. Break laws, get laws. Break laws, get laws. You know, in our house, Brooke and I have a few rules. We don't have 613, but my kids think we have 613, but we probably don't even have 20. I mean, we have a few. And one of them, simple. Be in bed by 10 o'clock on a school night. Simple. You know how many times that's happened? I mean, I can count those a lot easier than I can count the times they haven't made it to bed. It's amazing the things that they realize they have to do at 9:58 p.m. It's amazing. And simple. These are simple rules, but even us, we struggle to obey. And if we go on into Deuteronomy, you know, Moses realizes that the Israelites are having a challenge here fulfilling all these commandments. And as we lay out here in Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 16, Moses tells the people, "Now what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It isn't up in heaven so that you have to ask who will ascend to heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it. Nor is it beyond the sea so you have to ask who will cross the sea and get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it. No, the word is very near to you. It's in your mouth and in your heart so that you may obey it." He says, "See, I set before you a life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess." So we know in the Old Testament there's these series of laws, people rebelling, and we know beyond Deuteronomy what Moses is telling them starts to play out, right? When we look in Judges and the downward spiral that we see there and all those things when people do not obey the commandments, what happens? So the key thing here that I found interesting is this thread of it's in your mouth and in your heart. And if you're going to really impact things, getting it in your mind and in your heart really starts to be the way to change your behaviors. If you're going to gain obedience, right, you affect your mind and their heart. It's not I wake up and have a list of 613 things a day and I go, I did not do this one, I did this one, I did this one. No, it should become how you live your life. And we fast forward into Jeremiah, and what's cool here is we realize that the one simple rule, don't eat fruit, didn't work. We realize that now we've got 600 and some different commandments, and that's not working. But yet those have been all examples that had to play out to show us God's glory, His love, His mercy, His grace. And now we get into Jeremiah, and Jeremiah in chapter 31, starting in verse 31, says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt," like we just read, "because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. It will be their God and it will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor to say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their wickedness and I will remember their sins no more." So once again, we hear this theme of writing it in their minds and writing it on their hearts to really penetrate their heart so that they live their life. They're willingly doing this, waking up every day, and it's part of how they live. It's part of what defines them as a person. It starts to become part of their character to how they imitate God. And so we know this new covenant that's talked about in Jeremiah is Jesus Christ. This is the new covenant that's referred to here. And we know that when God sends His Son, not only is it amazing in the sacrifice that He gave His own life for us, but He fulfilled all 600 and some different commandments, right? If that doesn't say He's the Son of God, I don't know what is. No other man could do it. Plenty of opportunity. He says it's not something you have to go and find. It's right here. It's simple. It's right here on paper. Just follow it. And man couldn't. In Matthew 5:17, it says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets," talking about Jesus coming here and about what we just read in the law of Moses. "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And Paul mentions this again in Romans 10, 1 through 4. "Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God. But their zeal is not based on knowledge, since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own. They did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes." And I'm going to continue on here in Romans 10, 5 through 10. Because, again, Paul refers back to what we were talking about in the Old Testament. He says, Moses writes this about the righteousness that is by the law. The person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that by faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or who will ascend to the deep? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near to you. It is in your mouth and is in your heart. It's exactly what we just read earlier that Moses spoke. That is the message concerning faith that we proclaim. And if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and with your mouth that you'll profess your faith and are saved. Another place in Romans chapter 5, I'm not going to read this, but in Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 12, the header in my Bible says, death through Adam, life through Christ. And if you read that passage, it does refer all the way back to Adam. And ultimately, it talks about Adam, by his sin, brought kind of universal ruin on the human race. But Christ, through this one righteous act that he ends up doing, brings universal blessing. So, as I start to close, mankind wasn't able to handle one simple rule, 600 commandments, but now, through Jesus Christ, we have a path of forgiveness, we have a path towards salvation, and one of the things in Matthew 22, starting in verse 34, where it says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together, and one of them, an expert in the law, tested him this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. We've been hearing this heart, mind theme throughout Old Testament and even here. He goes on to say, this is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So we kind of get it boiled down for us here. And when I start to think about this piece of it, it starts to, for me, formulate a lens by which we start to see everything we do through, and it's love. Maybe Paul McCartney, John Lennon, all we need is love. We start to have this lens of love that's repeated in so many verses that I read here this evening. And we know further in the New Testament that there's an aspect of faith that we've been talking about in class this morning, and we know there's an aspect of works, and we need to have both faith and works. And so this simple diagram, I sometimes think in PowerPoint, so I had to had this picture in my head, and I had to put it down, and it may not be perfect, but it's some things I thought about as we thought about imitating God. Because it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And to me, our relationship with God becomes the substance of faith that we're talking about. How do we strengthen our faith in God? And the stronger our faith becomes, the more it impacts our conscience, our behaviors, our characteristics. And we start to emulate good works. And the more good works we do, strengthens our faith. And that pleases God. And then we do more good works. And it's almost like love's this rocket fuel kind of in between all this, the catalyst that enables all this to happen. And so that's just how I think about it after going through this lesson. The more we know who we are in Christ, the more we'll act like him. And the more we know our Father, the more we'll want to be imitators of him. Today, we all have free will. We all have the ability to make decisions and choices. This evening, you all have a choice. You can choose to be imitators of God. You can demonstrate your faith and love to God through Jesus Christ. It's a step that really can strengthen your faith and start you down a path of letting that faith impact your works. Knowing you have forgiveness when you slip and fall, because we will. We have since the beginning of time. And it's amazing to me when I think about people I encounter. I've thought about this more and more recently. Sometimes I encounter people that may not be living according to what, at least I understand, to be living as a Christian. And so in my mind, I've got this checkbox. Oh, they're not doing this right. They're not doing that right. And do I embrace that or do I shut that out, right? And part of me now is like, well, why would I expect that of them if they don't have faith? Why would they be doing those good works if they don't have faith? And if they don't have faith, who is embracing them to help them gain that faith if it's not me? And so it's a piece that I think we have today as we think about the choices we can make and the free will we have. And if anyone has the need, they can come forward today, be baptized, or even receive prayers from the congregation. Whatever the need may be, you can come forward as we stand and sing at this time.